All right, let's get this meeting started, this discussion. We'd like to welcome Suling Panoke today as part of our Good Cause Foundation together with Rise series here on economic inclusion. Just a quick biography about Suling Panoke. She is a visionary leader, social entrepreneur, and international trainer and facilitator with a passion for empowering today's leaders to rethink, create, and innovate. She has recently been named Senior Vice President of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion for Zions Bank. In this role, she is responsible for directing the bank's strategic vision, developing a comprehensive DIE strategy, and delivering on a plan of action to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion across the bank and the community that it serves. Suiling is also the founder of Rethink International, a global social enterprise and international training organization designed to challenge people to rethink how and what they think. She has trained thousands of leaders around the world, leading in politics, business, government, higher education, nonprofits, international NGOs, and the media on a wide range of leadership and communication topics. Areas of expertise include global leadership, personal empowerment, developing women leaders, diversity, equity, inclusion, unconscious biases, strategic communications, power speaking, branding, civil discourse, and building cultures of inclusion in the workplace. Swiling also founded the Rethink Tank, a social think tank that hosts power conversation, bringing together people with diverse points of view for the purpose of building bridges across social, cultural, racial, and political differences. She was she also founded Politics Media, a global leadership and media training organization that seeks to democratize the media landscape by training women, people of color, and emerging young leaders to use the media as a vehicle to impact public policy. Swilling continues to serve in various capacities across the state of Utah. She is the proud mother of of an intellectually curious teenage daughter who is taller, smarter, and much more mature than she is. After living in Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. for 13 years, she has moved back to Mr. Rogers' neighborhood in Salt Lake City, Utah, where they reside together with their red toy poodle, Rue. Welcome, Swilling.
Thank you so much, Chike, for the warm welcome. God, that was so long. Basically, I work with people and I host a whole series of conversations. So really looking forward to tonight's conversation. Just wanted to share with everyone, I'm zooming in from Washington, D.C. I'm actually visiting at our nation's capital, and I wish you had a better view. But I'm just going to try to show you. I'm on the wharf. You can kind of see the reflection of my hotel room. And I apologize if you hear airplanes taking off or landing behind me. That is DCA. So such an honor to be here with all of you. Looking forward to tonight's conversation.
Thank you, Swilling. You literally summed up the whole bio in like one sentence. And I was just wondering, why did she just write it in one sentence?
Yeah, well, thank you for the details, and thank you for sharing the details about my daughter. They're all true.
Perfect. Perfect. Okay, so let's get this conversation going. So, Swilling, based on your background, your experience, where you're coming from, historically, I guess this is kind of like the first question. Let's dive in. Historically, people of color have received inferior treatment from major American societal institutions, the government, during, for medical care, the economy, law, and so on. And the banks and other financial institutions are not an exception to this kind of treatments of with regards to people of color and minorities as a whole. So can you help us understand, how have people of color received inferior treatment from banks and other financial institutions? And what kind of impact has this had on both on individual level and generally on our society?
Yeah, thank you so much, Chike, for that question. And I just want to say, in the world of diversity, equity, inclusion, it is so important to understand history. right? With every learning experience that I design, I always make sure to integrate that historical component. The reason why we are in the situations that we're in right now. And oftentimes when people either don't feel comfortable or aren't necessarily on board with some sort of social justice effort or uh, diversity and inclusion strategy in their organizations or in their communities, it's because they don't understand the historical significance. And what so many communities of color and women are fighting for is equal treatment, fair opportunity, access, and capital. We're not looking for special treatment or extra this and that, but historically, if you do the research, you will understand that there's specific communities, and generally it's women and communities of color who just did not start off on a fair playing field, if you will. So I wanted to, and the critical role that policy and laws play in this is essential to understand, which is essentially what fueled my passion to pursue a career in politics. Oftentimes, getting more women, people of color elected to public office. The ultimate vision is to produce more fair and just policies that impact our lives, right? Our livelihood. So there are just three key pieces historically that I wanted to note that have essentially led us to the economic divide, the racial wealth gap that we see happening in America today. First and foremost, slavery and Jim Crow that concentrated basically through slavery and that Jim Crow era. A lot of workers of color were fall into chronically undervalued occupations. So it's been very difficult for a lot of members of the Black community, over the past 400 years to climb that ladder, right? Whereas generally in a lot of majority white communities, they started off with that generational wealth. They started off in leadership roles, positions of power in our communities and across our society, and that's been passed down from generation to generation to generation. So it's essentially, we're all watching the Olympics right now. For example, using track as an analogy, all the athletes start at the same starting point. But here in America, this has not been the case. For women and people of color, they've started far behind the starting point of our Caucasian counterparts. And so that is why we're continuing to see those gaps, those economic gaps. And so just wanted to note that piece. The New Deal programs, after the Great Depression, they helped a lot of poor communities. They helped millions of Americans across the country. And, sometimes policies, you can go into them, designing them with the best of intentions, but they end up having these, what we call unintended consequences. So although they helped a lot of poor white families across the country, there were specific occupations that were excluded from them. And overwhelming majority of Black Americans and other communities of color fell into those occupations. And so they were left out of a lot of those benefits that so many white families were able to take advantage of. And then the third piece, just wanted to note, is the underfunding and limited scope of anti-discrimination agencies. Now, we have a major agency here in America called the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And they are, their role is to hold organizations, public and private sector organizations accountable for equal opportunity, fair treatment in the workplace, things like that. And they oftentimes, these agencies, the national one and also the local ones in our states, are underfunded and don't necessarily have the capacity to be as effective as they could be. So there have been it's just important to note, there have been key policies and laws, just as you stated, Chike, that have impacted certain groups, generally, again, women and people of color economically, and have still continued to keep them, contributed to the racial wealth gap that we're continuing to see today.
That's I think so, Ling, that's interesting that you kind of went way back into the historical context, because I think when people understand the why, they are more likely to move. They are more likely to show compassion and empathy to the cause of others. Um,
Absolutely.
right.
Absolutely.
Right. So as the Senior Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Zions Bank, we can presume that your role is to champion economic inclusion within your organization. So on that
Yes.
note, can you tell us a little about what you mean, or how do you define economic inclusion?
Yes, UK, thank you so much for that question. And I also want to note, okay, one resource that I always refer people to, you've heard of the Breakfast Club,
Right.
the radio show.
Mhm.
So a man named Byron Allen, who is a self-made multimillionaire, he just purchased the Weather Channel. He made a lot of his money in the media and entertainment industry. He was interviewed by the Breakfast Club, and he speaks about economic inclusion. So I want to refer your entire audience to watch this YouTube interview, probably the most powerful interview that I've ever seen on YouTube. He tells his personal story, and Byron Allen, he, was born to his mother was 15, I believe. At the time, she was a single mother. He was born into poverty right in the midst of the civil rights movement. And now he has been able to just really make a name for himself and achieve the American dream. Now, he purchased the rights to Coretta Scott King's story. And in that interview, he talks about a conversation he had with her. And they're talking about the 4 pillars of achieving true equality here in America. And they are: number 1, end slavery; number 2, end Jim Crow; number 3, achieve civil rights; and the 4th and final chapter is economic inclusion. Now, long before I stepped into the bank, when I received their offer, probably back in October of last year, I started doing research about, I want to hit the bank, I want to hit the ground running once I step into that role, and started doing a lot of research around how we should socialize diversity, equity, inclusion as a bank. And there's a very specific role that banks and financial institutions play in the bigger picture of achieving true equality in America, and that is economic inclusion, right? They have the power to increase access, opportunity, and invest our capital. And so it was very intentional, right? In terms of using that term. I also just want to note that is not my term, is not Zions Bank's term, is Martin Luther King's term. And also recognizing his life story, the reason why his life, right? Looking at his life. Oftentimes we think of the March on Washington, right? Which was huge and significant. But Coretta Scott King also notes that wasn't the reason why they took his Martin, why he was assassinated. It was because of his speech, The Other America. And in that speech, he was organizing, this is after the March on Washington, what they call the Poor People's March. And he was going to deliver 250,000 Americans to our nation's capital in the fight for economic justice. An overwhelming majority of those people were white. And that was a threat to the government, the administration at the time, and it ultimately led to his demise. And so literally the first meeting I stepped into at the bank, I sat down with our number 1, number 2, and number 3 at the bank. So number 1 is our CEO, Scott Anderson. Number 2, our CFO, Kay Hall. And number 3 is Rob Bruff, our marketing director. And these are 3 white men. And sat down in that room, talked about this story, Martin Luther King, how economic inclusion was a dangerous game for a Black man in America to play in the 60s. And it ultimately led to Dr. Martin Luther King's demise. But in 2020 and 2021, for 3 white men, like my colleagues, my equitable partners that I'm working with now to champion economic inclusion, I think we have a fighting chance. Right. And sometimes I cringe saying things like that, but it's still the reality of what we live in today here in America. And so Championing economic inclusion is the name of the game in the banking and financial services industry. And I just got back from the UBA convention in Sun Valley, Idaho. That's all the Utah bankers gather once a year and talk about the industry moving forward, best practices, economic outlook for next 5, 10, 15 years. And I was so thrilled to hear so many local, statewide, and federal leaders in the industry talking about financial inclusion, economic inclusion, and recognizing there are still members of our communities and our society that are left out of the system, right? And that's a problem. The role that we play as banks is, and this is our tagline at Zions Bank, building economic inclusion by opening opportunity, increasing access, and investing our capital. And when I say capital, I mean three things: human capital, that's our people; social capital, the relationships, the trust that we have amongst our teams, with our clients, and ultimately in the community, with our community. And the third thing is financial capital, our monetary investments. And so banks and other financial institutions have a responsibility to really examine what those monetary investments look like. And are we opening opportunity? Are we increasing access? Because when you help others, create opportunities for others to succeed economically, we all win. And one thing that I'm very proud to just be associated with the Zions Bank brand, because they've always been about investing in community, which is why Zions Bank is one of the highest trust brands, I would argue, clearly in the state of Utah, on the West Coast, the Western United States, and I would also say in the banking industry. Zions Bank means something because we've always invested heavily in the community.
Well, thanks for sharing all of that. Going back to where you started on this particular, answering this question, referencing that YouTube video. And for some of our audience who are not familiar with that, that MLK speech, The Other America, let's take some time and actually go back, either read it or spend some time just understanding it. I think that's very important. So Suiling, in 2021, some would argue that if you have education, if you have all the qualifications, if you have maybe the experience, the market will come to you. What do you think about this state of mind? And if applicable, please feel free to tell us the pitfalls of that statement. So in other words, like, why do we even have to be talking about economic inclusion in 2021? So from your description, we are coming from the 60s where, hey, it's a very dangerous game. People lost their lives. MLK was one of those. But today we are saying, hey, we already achieved that. Why should we even be having that conversation today?
Chike, that is such an important question. And I hear it oftentimes, in this DEI space. The reason why is because, policy-wise, we may have passed the policies that are needed, right, to begin to open up those doors, to open up those opportunities and increase access to education, to set people up for success. But there's still a lot of invisible barriers. I'm talking about the social barriers, the cultural barriers, racial barriers, gender barriers that still exist in public and private sector organizations, right? That are continue to hold people back. And that is oftentimes what the role of diversity, equity, inclusion officers or, senior vice presidents like myself play in the corporate arena in particular. I'm in the private sector now, but I've developed DEI strategies in both the public sector and private sector. Majority of my DEI experience has been in the political arena. And let me just briefly share the difference between those strategies. Whenever you're developing a DEI strategy, and again, going back to defining what diversity, equity, inclusion is, it's essentially people, right? Any aspect of your business, organization that has to do with people, that's diversity, equity, inclusion, right? Diversity really is defined by the differences that exist amongst any given group of people, and they are vast. Even here at Zions Bank, they are wide and deep, those differences. And I'm talking about different perspectives, different experiences, also different skills, talents, personalities. All of those attributes contribute to an organization's diversity. So it's important to define diversity as broadly as possible. Inclusion has to do with the culture, the environment in which any given group of people are operating in. So it's important to note that as well. The more inclusive culture that you can build in your organization, that is when employees or people start to feel valued. They feel heard, they feel supported. And when you feel all of those things as an employee, you perform at your best. And that ultimately leads to a high performance organization. That's why building inclusive cultures in the workplace is so important. And it is deeply, deeply tied to any organization's business strategy. Oftentimes DEI programming is separate, right? It's set aside for women and people of color, right? Which is, again, why we have to define diversity much more broadly and include our white male counterparts in that definition, because they absolutely play a critical role in our progress. And then thirdly, equity is the fairness tool, right? The manner in which we do business. It's that honesty, accuracy, transparency, integrity, all of those things that, again, contribute to building those trusting relationships. So just wanted to go back and kind of define clearly what diversity, equity, inclusion actually is, and why it's so important. So back to your question, why do we still need to have these conversations? Because of that. So a lot of the conversations that I host here at the bank and in our community address those invisible barriers to success that still exist. And just looking back, just one quick example, Brown versus Board of Education, right? When we desegregated, the desegregation of America's public school system. Now, once that law was passed, it wasn't immediately implemented, right? It took some time for people to adjust to that new way of life. And the same thing exists here in the workplace, right? In the corporate arena here in America, or wherever you may, wherever your